welcome everyone to this first panel discussion of the day. This is a session all around future skills, identifying where the skills gaps exist in the insurance market, how job roles are evolving, and how we go about reskilling the talent that we do have at our disposal. So it's going to be a very interesting session. I'm joined by Antony, or I'm not joined by Antony, but he will be here in a moment. Antony from Aon Human Capital Solutions. We've also got Des Bishop, who is Group Head of People Development at Hiscox, and Andrew Oakley, Head of LMA Academy for Lloyd's Market Association. And the eagle-eyed among you may have noticed that Andy's colleague Fiona Temple was originally down to speak in the session, but unfortunately she's not well enough to speak today, and Andy has valiantly stepped in at very short notice. So thank you for doing that, Andy. And I think the phrase thrown under the bus might come to mind, but we will go easy on you and get well soon to Fiona if you're watching. I think you probably owe Andy a pint. And here's Antony, everyone. So brilliant. So Andy, I'm actually going to start the session with you, if I may. You've got obviously a good market view at the LMA there. So can you give us a bit of an assessment of what you're seeing in terms of where skills are really needed the most in the insurance workforce at the moment? Where are you seeing most demand for training in the LMA Academy?
Yeah, sure, of course. I guess, let's just put all this into context, and it's probably worth just sort of taking a step back and looking at the environment in which we're in at the moment. So, clearly the London market at the moment is responding to the whole changing world of risk and work, impacted by the global events of COVID, climate change. We've then got the economic impact from rising costs, inflation, and so on. And then we've got the market-specific events, such as Future at Lloyd's. And I guess all of this is kind of just throwing everything in the air and really challenging the business strategy, and it's generating responses from culture, flexible working, well-being, digitization, sustainability, and that list kind of continues. So what we need to do here is really look at the need to invest in the skills that are required as we look forward. And I know many of us know that, but I suspect in many ways, a lot of us don't actually know what some of those skills are even going to be we're going to need going forward. So in terms of your answer specifically, I really see the demand for training and reskilling in probably 4 or 5 areas. So without a shadow of doubt, the over-the-shoulder learning and support for new and young professionals. COVID really, prevented all of that happening. And what I saw and what I heard over the past couple of years was a real need for that to come back and come back with a vengeance as well. So that over-the-shoulder learning for sure. Linked to that then is kind of the transfer of knowledge from our experienced professionals in the market. How do you shift that knowledge, that experience from the experienced folks to those new, young talent coming into the market? And there are different ways to do that. We've then got the continued development of technical skills and knowledge. That continues at a pace. There's always something to know more about, the market, the class of business, the line of business you work in. Human skills, the soft skills, the interpersonal skills, we all call them different things. That will continue as well. Whilst it's great being a technical, expert in the market, you've then got the human element as part of that as well. So for me, that's critical. And then you add in everything to do with data, technology, robotics, AI, all of those areas will continue to play, an ever increasing role as technology advances. And, it will fundamentally change how and when we do things within the market. So, 4 or 5 areas there. So I hope that kind of goes some way to answering your question.
Yeah, absolutely. And you teed us up for a lot of things that hopefully we'll cover. I mean, it's a really interesting point about how hybrid working affects the sort of organic learning process. That's a big challenge that we can perhaps talk about later. So Antony, I'll just bring you in. I know obviously your approach is very data led. So what is the data telling you about where the skills gaps are in the insurance industry?
Yeah, thanks, Antony. Just checking you can hear me okay. My switch over. Great. Data led, absolutely. And just to give you 30 seconds on that, we collect a lot of information around rewards for insurance and financial services organizations, and we do that within a job architecture framework. So that enables us to look at individual organizations that send us data. We can see how many people they've got in different roles, and we've actually done an assessment of that architecture. So we can very quickly start to look at what are the skills associated with those different roles. And I talked just a few minutes ago about establishing a baseline, understanding what we have, and that's a good way for us to start from that perspective. To answer the question, though, Anthony, I think unquestionably what comes up more than anything else for organizations is things around data skills and technology skills, whether it's specific platforms. They are unquestionably, it's the technical skills that firms will talk about first and firms will recognize first. But actually, I think it's probably bigger concern the things that it's not telling us because we're not testing for, right? When we talk about technical skills, they generally, to Andy's point, they have a relatively short life cycle. 2 to 5 years is the kind of established understanding for a lot of technical skills. But what about the skills that we need in order to be able to have a workforce that could absorb newer skills as they come through? So it's those softer human skills that Andy mentioned, things around learnability, curiosity, innovation. These are the kind of skills that perhaps organizations are not necessarily testing for at this point, and probably where we would see the bigger gaps coming through ultimately. The challenge here is, of course, you're talking about a slightly longer term solution, and we're in backs to the wall crisis mode at this point with everything that's been going on. I talked earlier about the great convergence, and they are very much things that are upon us right now. So we're trying to solve for things right now, but at the same time, I think we need to be thinking more and more about future-proofing ourselves and ensuring that we have those skill sets that allow us to evolve as an organization, become that agile organization that can cope with business change, that can cope with, if we have periods of slightly higher turnover, if we cope with a hard recruitment market where we can't get people in, do we have the kind of skills internally that allow us to repurpose people, whether we borrow, whether we repurpose people entirely, but it means we're not just about recruitment when we feel like we have gaps.
Brilliant. And Des, how's what you've heard so far kind of tally with your own experience? And can you tell us a little bit about how Hiscox is approaching this and where kind of the skills challenges are for you as an organisation?
Well, you'd be unsurprised to find that there's nothing that Andy or Antony have said I disagree with. If I start with kind of the data and the automation side, I mean, it's clear in terms of the, looking forward, and when we've done our own analysis of where the future might be going in terms of both underwriting and claims, that need to respond to and kind of manage the data that comes in, just understand the kind of the plethora of information that comes down the line and be able to make sense of it, excuse me. And then the automation that comes with managing and servicing either the customers that come in who want to come in direct or via brokers, and the ability to respond to that both in the moment and then future focused is going to be key. I think how we have started to look at it is being trying to look at how do our customers perceive they want to purchase insurance. So if I look, Andy's mentioned the younger generation coming through, the generations that come after them, are kind of purchasing things in a completely different way to the way certainly I've experienced it. Even the people who are purchasing whether insurance or goods now, that'll look different going forward. So we can see going forward there's going to be a customer-led change to the way we have to respond, and that will be driven by whether it's personalized insurance offerings, where the customer goes direct via platforms or direct to insurer to purchase stuff, and they don't want to talk to someone. They trust themselves because they bought everything on their phone historically. They'll just go through and purchase it straight away. Then there'll be, obviously that's maybe more for the simple stuff or the less complex risks, but as one goes up where the risk complexity becomes a bit more demanding, then I think that's where it puts more of an emphasis on how we respond in terms of, I think Antony mentioned those kind of human skills that's going to be needed to service the people that come through. So again, they don't want to talk to people unless they have to. So how do we keep the need for information from them as limited as possible, and then keep kind of how can I describe it, the empathetic customer service piece in the right place to ensure that they get what they're looking for when they need it. If I think about what we're doing now, I think we started our journey around looking at the future of our underwriting population. A couple of years ago, some of the research that sits behind some of the conversations we've had historically, there's the KPMG did stuff in the London market, McKinsey have done a lot of work, PwC have done a lot of work. So that's influenced our thinking in terms of the way the future might be going. And we've now started to try to rebuild our underwriter development framework to have that future focused perspective. So again, linking back to Antony, we don't necessarily know where the future is going to go. We know it's going to be completely different. And it's kind of taken those first few steps to guide ourselves down the way we think it's going to go, and then backtrack and start to develop our team now, our underwriters at all the different levels, to respond to what we think will be the way our customers want to do purchase insurance going forward.
That makes sense, and we'll certainly go a bit deeper into the Future Skills initiative you've been working on. I was just wondering, quick follow-up question as well. I mean, you mentioned automation, and when you talk about talent, the first thing a lot of people always say is, "Oh, all these jobs are going to go." or need to, and that's why we're doing a huge reskilling project as an industry, isn't it? Just wondering, from your perspective, how much of an influence automation is already having on job roles within the company, and do you see that kind of accelerating? Or
well, for me, I think there is. I don't think there'll be necessarily less roles, but the role mix and the skill mix will be different. So I can see in that digital space where customers want to go direct, then if I use a dreadful analogy of a washing machine, you put your clothes in, it comes through the system and software, and out it comes clean. So there's no human touch at all. There'll be some that needs a bit more of a look at, and I think that's where you'll get the traditional underwriting skills being required to build on top of that, perhaps more customer service piece. And then you'll still have that those large complex risks that people are going to need a much more human interaction. So I don't think necessarily the number will change. I think the particularly for the larger risks, I think the way the large risk underwriters and claims professionals deal with and manage and respond to their world will differ, because I think there'll be much more of a human interaction in those instances. But the more straightforward risks, the way they're both purchased or sold, and then with the claims resolution that comes off the back of it, there will still be the need for roles to respond to that. Maybe it's, in fairness, it's probably bringing people in to the insurance sector that wouldn't necessarily consider a role in the insurance sector, because there's a different type of skill mix coming in. And then it frees up, the way we would see it, it frees up the more our underwriting community and our claims professionals to get more involved in the complex risks and the more thought-provoking risks. I don't think anyone would argue that we've got more than enough to be getting on with. So the more we can kind of drill down and make sure that the purchase decisions and the claims are dealt with in an automated way as much as possible, that frees up the current resource we've got to deal with the more complex risks and to have the more human interaction, as opposed to, and giving time to have that human interaction, which possibly not necessarily they have the time to do so, or they feel like they've got the time to do so.
And Andy, in terms of kind of what you're seeing through the academy at LMA, presumably a lot of the people that are getting trained are being trained because technology is changing the requirements of their role. Is that a fair comment? What are you seeing from your end?
Yeah, it is, absolutely. However, and it is quite a big however, is that we still continue to see the needs for kind of what some of the day-to-day skills are. And I think a lot of it is, both Des and Antony have touched on this, is I'm not sure everyone really knows what the future skills are going to be. Now, what we are seeing is a lot of inquiries into some of those niche skills. So data, AI, risk, Python programming, for example, for some of the actuarial teams. But right now, we're still seeing some of those real core skills. So some of the foundation programs, and this maybe goes back to my comment earlier around that over-the-shoulder learning, the new talent that's coming into the market still really needs to get up to speed quite quickly and be productive as well. So those foundation programs, the whole piece around business acumen, commercial acumen is absolutely critical. You know, how do you make money on writing a risk? What are some of the key ratios? How can you influence the profitability of a book of business? And what sort of levers are within your control? And then as well, you know, talent coming into the industry for the first time. So an introduction to Lloyd's, to the London market. What is it we do in this fabulous market that we all work in? And, you know, what are some of the lines of business? What are some of the impacts on the market at the moment with some of the global trends that we're hearing? So it's a little bit of everything at the moment, Antony. And, you know, the bit that I picked up, the other Antony talked about was agility. For me, that is absolutely critical going forward. It's having the ability, the agility, the flexibility to shift and change depending on what the need is. And linked to that is that notion of learning agility. How much do people want to learn new skills? And how curious are people? Antony, you talked about that as well. And that's what will either be the enabler or the barrier to how successful we reskill the market. And that goes down to the whole piece around change and how people adapt and embrace to change.
Brilliant, thanks, Andy. And there's obviously a big spectrum of sophistication and maturity in terms of how companies are approaching this. Probably particularly in London, where you go from a massive syndicate down to a couple of people in a tiny little MGA. So, Antony, just wondering where you start with this in terms of assessing your needs and actually what are the steps you need to go through to actually put an effective skills/talent strategy in place?
Yeah, it's. I think it's. I will dovetail off the back of what Andy was saying and recognise fully it's a change process, and we all should brace ourselves for the fact that it is change, but it's change for the right reasons. So I think that it's important for organisations to make sure that they start to think about what we have, as I've talked about before, right? We have to develop a language around skills, and we have to be clear in terms of what we're trying to achieve. It may not be that we're going across the whole of the organisation to begin with. We may be starting in certain key areas, but it is starting to help people understand what we're trying to achieve. You know, once we do have some level of understanding of what we currently have in place, what we need to do then is to start building that into some sort of skills architecture, job career pathing that makes sense to our organisation. And that step is really important, because what's so important for people to understand, to embrace this kind of stuff, is that we have the right level of transparency, that people can understand where they're headed to, where they're going, what does this mean? And that doesn't mean complete transparency, it's a spectrum, but we need to have a level of transparency that's appropriate to our organisation. You know, we need to show our working, we need to explain ourselves to people, because again, we're in a change process and we need to build some trust. The next bit is probably some of the hardest parts of it is thinking to the future. You know, how do we see that what we currently have and that what we need, how do we see that evolving? And that isn't just a one-off, it's going to continue to evolve, but can we start to formulate that viewpoint on what does it look like in a year's time or in 3 years' time? Where are we headed? We know we're not going to be able to fill all of those gaps through this kind of program, but there's opportunities there to fill some of them. And what I think is a great representation on that, I know we were going to talk a little bit about some of the smaller firms, Antony, is, you know, if in conversations with lots of firms, if we really challenge them around, you know, this stuff isn't entirely new to you, because how many times have you had that top performer who was going to leave and we ended up moving them across to perform a different role because actually that was more aligned to their skill set? You know, there's little strands of evidence of this having happened and it being successful, but it's difficult to think more holistically about that. So maybe if we start small, that is a helpful way of doing it. You know, one of the things we've seen quite a lot from some of the underwriting agencies is that they've taken people into, for example, their audit teams as a start point, as a bit of a grounding in the business, and then very quickly move those out into other roles. That's just one example. But again, there's little strands around of where this has happened in the past. Why can't we start to fold that out more and more broadly and recognise that we're already doing some of it?
Brilliant. Thanks, Anthony. We've got a good question that's come in around rewards and salary expectations. I know that's something we're hoping to talk about later, so we'll get to that in a bit. But Des, would you be able to just talk us through your approach at Hiscox, specifically around the Future Skills project that you've been doing in underwriting? Can you kind of talk us through the process? I think that'd be very interesting.
Sure. So I suppose our journey, should we say, is always about a journey. Probably started a couple of years ago, just before COVID hit. So we'd already started to with our new CEO, Julie Marcel, who's very much a strategic thinker around, where she sees her underwriting strategy going forward. She took the view, quite rightly, that we need to start preparing and planning for the future. So we started to have conversations around what could that future look like for our underwriting community, and the skills development and talent development processes we need to put in place to make us fit for the future. So we started off with, bringing all the CEOs from the business units together essentially for the first time. So historically, the CEOs worked independently. Jo, leading from the front, brought all her CEOs together and started to get them to operate as a leadership team, taking responsibility for the collective development of all the underwriters across the group. Excuse me. And in facilitating conversations with that leadership team, I got them to agree around, when we look forward, that for the first time, a particular level underwriter in one part of the business will have the same technical knowledge and skills as an underwriter in a different part, whether it be big ticket businesses or retail, and use that from the bottom up as a way of linking back to something that Antony said about talent, developing talent. We took the view that our underwriters of the future needed to be polymaths. So it wasn't just a case of being very good at underwriting in a particular line of business. They had to be conscious of different markets. Possibly they've worked in claims, possibly worked in operations. So they had a wide level of expertise to get to those more senior roles, which could then influence the development of all the people that followed through after them. So our start for 10 then was linking in with each of the CEOs, using the kind of the research from McKinsey, KPMG, etc., as a backdrop to say, okay, that's what these research institutes are saying. What do we think? What's your view of the next 5 to 8 years? And you may not get it right, but what's your sense of direction? So in conversations, we created, okay, for your market, whether it be London market or RE, what's the knowledge, skills and behaviors you think are going to be necessary to be successful in the future? And literally going from one to the other, using the previous CEO's start for 10, talking to the next CEO, and using that tried and trusted old maths thing of a Venn diagram. We have to pull together, okay, what was common across all our underwriting business units and what was specific to a particular business unit. So within the space of a couple of months, we had a clear sense of what did we perceive was going to be important to us, different bands of underwriters, both now, because we needed to look at the here and now, and also to prepare for the future. And unsurprisingly, some things like data management, automation came through loud and clear, data science. But interestingly, also, in addition to kind of the polymath view, there was this view that we need underwriters going forward to be business builders at all levels. So whether that be in the big businesses through London market and reinsurance, or even business builders at a more junior level. And what we've now done since pulling that force together, we've created a faculty of underwriting, which I'm sure many other insurers have, and we're promoting and pushing learning which will develop underwriters at all levels through those through from junior underwriter to senior underwriter through to underwriting leader. And off the back of that, again, in reference to Antony's point, we're creating a talent exchange program. So we know that if we want the CEOs of the future to be those polymaths, so the underwriting needs to be polymaths in an insurance context, we need to move them around in their junior roles more effectively. I think as I matured through the career development work I did at Aviva and Virgin, it was always a case we put it down to the individual. You plan your career. Here's the opportunities. You plan it for yourselves. Organizationally, we now know that if we want our businesses to grow and evolve for the future, we've got to help and kind of create those opportunities for people to move around and get that experience. not just in different lines of business, but through working in claims, working in operations. Now, historically, some companies might have done that through a graduate scheme. We don't want to do it through a graduate scheme. We want to do it through our high potential talent at our underwriter and junior and senior underwriter level, so they're ready for the next roles coming through. So the talent exchange program is key to moving people around, but built off the background of we now know what good looks like at our underwriter, senior underwriter, underwriting leader. Our underwriters know what good looks like, which was a bit of a surprise to me, because you tend to think that everybody knows what good looks like, but now we've got a common language around what good technical knowledge, technical skills, behavioral skills, management and leadership development looks like, and that's what we can promote. We can promote through our faculty of underwriting, and so I think we're early doors. We're kind of 2 years down the line. The way we've positioned it is very much around a kind of a universe. So as we all know from Hawkins' work, the universe is expanding. So we can, as our thinking evolves in terms of the learning and development needed to support at different levels, the learning development options will expand. So people can start to chart their learning through to evolve in their current role and then for the future role.
Lots of people now scribbling down their talent universes. And is the approach you've taken there specifically with underwriting, would you say that's fairly easily roll-outable to other functions within the insurance company? Or
I think the key elements of it and the infrastructure of it, absolutely so. Because whilst we can be led with the underwriting team, that's because we've got a very future-focused underwriting chief underwriting officer. Our other areas are coming through. So we will have a faculty of claims, and the claims guys will go down the same route. We anticipate having a faculty of operations, and one of the things that we've built alongside of that is very much around ensuring that people see a career path. The old word of spider webbing, they move across the different functional areas. So if you're in claims, there's opportunities to move into underwriting or into operations and vice versa. The key roles we want to look at are the chief underwriting officer roles, the group claims roles, and what makes great group claims managers and great CUOs is that ability to understand different aspects of the business. I think for us, the historical trend of one line of business gets you to line underwriter, gets you to divisional director. I think they're long gone. You need that breadth now, as opposed to kind of the one trick pony is very derogatory, but that kind of one market view. You need a broad view, and that's what we're now trying to evolve and develop.
Brilliant, thanks for that. That's really great insight into what you've been doing. Antony, I'm just going to ask you the next question. It's around the role of data. I mean, obviously, you want data involved in everything you do now. What is the role of data at the start of the process in terms of assessment of your needs, and also in terms of how you measure success as well as you're going along?
Yeah, I think what we are starting to see probably somewhat happily when we think about this as a topic is there are increasing numbers of kind of data providers out there that are trying to establish databases of skills and help people understand the kind of skills that exist. Some of those are done, from a very AI type perspective, and they're kind of combing through whether it's job listings or opportunities, LinkedIn, to gather together what are the typical skill sets that we see attached to different roles, and how can we help people to understand more and more about what that full remit of skills looks like. Coming back to what we talked about earlier on, and I think so much of the theme of these discussions has been around, we think about the immediacy of technical skills, but actually if we want to create this internal mobility, this agile workforce, we need to have these softer skills that allows us to retrain and retrain and retrain. And so, that kind of data can be really helpful in the early stages of really just getting something going, because again, start point is very much the challenge. When you talk about factors for success, I think the softer ones are more around, do we have more of a language, as I've talked about before, around skills within the organization? Do people have an understanding of what we're trying to do? And is there general comfort? Because without comfort comes resistance, and that just makes everything all the harder. So I do think a bit of that language, a bit of those kind of clarity of statements and everyone talking in a similar way about that is really important. That starts to feed through to some more of the tangibles around the employer value proposition that we can espouse when we're talking to potential candidates. You know, and then if we get to some of the harder facts of how do you measure success, if you like, you know, maybe hopefully we do end up in a place of seeing lower turnover. And again, if we're just focusing on certain functions, then we can recognize within those functions. That can start to impact in terms of things like things around recruitment spend, but we can also, maybe we can measure what does our talent migration percentages look like across the business versus just our percentages of people in and out of the organization. So I think that there's a number of different things we can start to look at with that. Of course, diversity, equity, inclusion is incredibly important in this sphere as well. And I think actually, as you think really carefully about diversity and equity inclusion, as I said during the keynote, it actually offers us opportunity, right? Because that, I think, is starting to address skill sets that we perhaps don't have as an organization, because we're looking at more diverse employees from different backgrounds. However you choose to look at diversity, it's an add. It's not just something else that we have to do. There's real opportunity in terms of building that diversity of skills that allows us to be a successful organization.
Brilliant, thank you. Now, obviously, we've heard a bit about what Hiscox is doing, and after this session, we've got Generali going to talk us through a really ambitious, huge scale reskilling program that they've done, where they've reskilled thousands and thousands of people. But Andy, what's your impression of kind of the challenges that some of the smaller firms in the market might face in actually executing this kind of thing?
Yeah, do you know what? It's no different than what we've talked about. I mean, I guess clearly smaller organizations, you're going to have increased, you know, demand upon, you know, people and capital. You know, where do you want to spend that money? But again, it goes back to what we've talked about all along, which is around, do you know what the future looks like? If you know what the future looks like, you can kind of take a step back and say, right, if we need this, these are some of the skills. Where do we see some of those skills gap right now? You know, clearly technology, you know, as you invest in new technology, there's huge costs associated with that. And I think as well, you know, smaller firms, in terms of the people element, you often find that people are double hatting. So it's actually physically having the time to actually focus on some of these initiatives rather than just looking at the day-to-day, is that ability to step back and kind of look into 3-5 years, rather than sort of, you know, working around and trying to deal with the here and now. So, you know, I think we've referenced it in many ways, but you know, do not underestimate the impact of technology in addition to people as well. One does not go without the other, for sure.
I'm just wondering if I can pick Des and Antony's brains then for a couple of kind of starting points for a company that's perhaps at the start of the journey and has limited resources. What should be your first priority to try and make it the biggest impact with the least resources? I don't know if Antony wants to start with that.
Yeah, sure. And, you know, I agree with those comments, Randy. I think that, you know, one of the things to recognize as a smaller organization, you know, if we just say small versus large, you know, larger firms are probably a little bit more comfortable or used to transition or change of people. If you just think about promotions, right? In a big firm, a promotion process is more typical, more common. We do see people moving through. Perhaps what we're talking about in this is a bit more people moving across into different functions, but the fact is they've already got some transition happening. And generally speaking, that's probably happening less in the smaller firms. So the dealing with a level of inertia is absolutely a case for them, and recognizing that. As I say, I think it's recognizing what we have. I do think it's okay. It's absolutely, you know, let's get started. Let's not be afraid to start small. Let's not be afraid to focus on one function. And, you know, that may be, it's likely to be that you will focus on, if you're in a small underwriting agency, then it's going to be your underwriting population where you'll start with that, because perhaps that's where we have the most value. And as we see that build out, we can work through that way. But I think starting with a bit of data, Antony, as I said earlier, that doesn't have to be a huge task. As I say, there's more and more providers out there that can help with that. And then we can kind of work forwards from that perspective. But I do recognise those challenges, and certainly talking with organisations, we can see. But I think it's important to reflect on. We can start very small, and we can probably reflect on some successes of the past already if we really think about it.
Des, I don't know if you could imagine a world in which your resources were significantly slashed.
I don't have to imagine that world. I'm living that world every day. Thank you very much.
What the tenets of a robust strategy would be if you were operating on a shoestring or a much smaller kind of ambition?
I continue to operate in a shoestring, as I always argue to my CHRO. So the I wouldn't disagree. I think the nuance I'd put to what Antony said is, for me, it would be particularly the smaller you are, and I've been in, Hiscox wasn't as big as it is now. When I joined, we were down 400 people, so it was not a dissimilar to approach I had then. So for me, it would be, what you're trying to achieve. It would be the starting off, what you're trying to achieve, or what do you need from your teams. What do you have now? So this is very straightforward. What are you trying to get to? What do you need? What are you trying to achieve? What have you got now? Where are the gaps based upon where you're trying to get to? And the some of the discussion we've had already has been very much around, moving people around. Now that's a relatively low cost option. So yes, there's always the need for formal maybe inputs, whether it be a professional qualification to the CII, leaning into the LMA, leaning into some of the Lloyd's training, which again is relatively inexpensive. But often some of the key things is to get that breadth of experience and to, was that empathetic, walk in the shoes of the people, would be to move people around with some oversight from that kind of wizened person who can look over their shoulder and point them in the right direction. That's a relatively low cost thing to do. Having those conversations around where you're going, where you are now, where the gaps are, and moving people around, that's not inordinately expensive, nor is, and I'll give LMA a bit of a promo, many of their technical skills programs to get from A to B. Equally, the CII, on that professional footing, you relatively inexpensive. So, if I go back to the Hiscox of old, I said back in 2006, there was only 400 of us. That was very much the approach. Let's use, because we were predominantly a London-focused business then, what can we use and what's available, what's cost effective, and we then created a kind of what we used to call a passport structure, whereby the line, we'd agree the technical knowledge and skills for that role in that area, and somebody would stamp them, their development as they went through it, and they get that stamp by working with their immediate line manager, who would kind of that sitting next to Nelly approach, deploying that skills and knowledge. But what we would do is ensure we'd assess that learning. And I think that's the big thing. So we didn't just rely upon the person giving the training to assess the training. We also put that in an independent mechanism for measuring the difference of that individual. So they're relatively and having practiced them in the past, cost effective and cheap solutions to move the talent agenda forward.
Brilliant. And you mentioned the wizened person who's going to pass on the kind of in-person advice, and so I think that's probably the moment to ask about how hybrid working is affecting this whole process. I don't know, Des, whether you've got anything formal in place at Hiscox or just anecdotally about how that is affecting the whole learning process and what you're trying to do about it.
Well, unsurprisingly, a great deal. The COVID, the pandemic, and the last two and a half years has created a seismic change, I think, in terms of the way both obviously employers manage, but also the way employees want to work. And I think Antony mentioned, the employee value proposition. And I think one of the things we're focusing on at Hiscox now is how do we respond in a very positive way to the way that our employees want to work. The way of everyone's going to be in the office 5 days a week is long gone, and therefore, and something else about the managing change and having that change agility. Our management and leadership population, we're all learning and stuff. We all stumbled through the first probably 12 months of the pandemic. We threw kind of virtual solutions in place. We provided forums for both employees and managers to get together to support each other. I think as we've come through that process, we've learned a great deal about supporting our managers to support their teams working both independently and interdependently. And on a positive note, I think we've not done such a bad job. I think the challenge, interesting, has been the recruitment through that period. So existing staff, some of those human interactions were there. So, you know, historically, our manager would have had their team in front of them or met them regularly. As we recruited through the crisis, that became much more of a challenge. And so supporting managers to onboard new staff, and you know that, and because the wizened individual wasn't sitting next to the newbie coming in, it did put a lot more of emphasis on both communication and reaching out and having much more of a regular contact in. It also put a bit more of an emphasis on you know, the HR and the L&D communities. And the big thing for us now is off the back of that was, how do you bring Hiscox into the home? And I think the future for many organizations, because I think we're not going back, will be, you know, how do you bring the not just the employee value proposition, but the employer into the homes of the new staff, who will spend more time working from home than they will do working from the office. And how do you make it a natural environment both to learn and be supported by the people around you? So and you know, I think without I don't know about where Generali is going, but you know, I see some of the work that Accenture are doing about, you know, they've got their online virtual reality in terms of, you know, you join Accenture and you enter a virtual reality of learning and onboarding. And I can see that's where we would want to go. You know, that's how you bring Hiscox into the home. You bring them into the home by, you know, giving them virtual headsets, the onboarding, you meeting your line manager and your peers in a virtual reality in the short term, knowing that face-to-face piece will come. And that's where we'd like to invest going forward. And we've started those conversations already.
Zuckerberg might be onto something after all, eh?
Well, perhaps we won't spend as much as he wants to spend, but or he wants us to spend. But I think that is the way forward. You know, how do you bring, not just for Hiscox, but for whoever, how do you bring the employment offering into the home, and how do you make it not threatening, something which people want to engage with? And I think that links back into the recruitment, because, you know, we've talked about change agility, but we need individuals in the insurance sector who are comfortable with change. And we need managers who can support staff who are uncomfortable with change and bring them on, because we don't want to lose people. We want to, as this is all about, we want to reskill and prepare them for the future. And, you know, we feel we recruit around our values. So someone who shares our values, we don't want to lose. We want to keep and reskill around the knowledge and skills that they're going to need to be more effective, but possibly in a different role.
Yeah. And Antony, do you have anything to add about, you know, what you're hearing from clients around hybrid working, how it affects things? Any tips?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. It's absolutely impacting, Antony. I think from our perspective, we would say it's probably impacting more than it should. And, you know, one of the things that's really important in this is considering, you know, if we are going to designate certain people, you know, maybe they're going to be office based, certain people hybrid, maybe certain people entirely virtual or entirely remote. Do they understand what those differences mean? Are we going through any kind of process to assess? Maybe certain people are more suited to virtual working than others. And that's not about saying to the people who are not so well suited to it, you can't do it. It's saying maybe we've got a skills gap that we need to address. You know, if I'm virtual, I probably need to be a little bit more outspoken, if you like, in meetings. I need to be asking more questions. If I'm stuck with something, no one's going to see me struggling with something. I really have to be aware that it's up to me to reach out and address some of those challenges. We're certainly working with organisations. I can think of one at the moment who are going through their data and seen that their loss of people at the end of the probation period is much, much higher than it's ever been. And that's actually been the organisation saying things aren't going the way we hoped, versus the individual, because their onboarding process hasn't been robust, appropriate. You know, as Des said, in the early stages of the pandemic change, we were all at 6s and 7s just trying to get the IT up and working, and we had to kind of
still trying to get it up and running.
Yeah, there is that, but we're trying to fly the plane and build it at the same time. But now 2 years in, we should have a level of sophistication around how we think about hybrid working. I think the other thing I would say is, and particularly when we think about skills and people's development, the conversation needs to change a bit from through the 2 years of the pandemic. It was very much, we said to all of our employees, think of yourself, right? It's about you. We want you to be safe. We want you to be healthy, stay at home, be at home. As the world now opens up again, we need to think about us, not just the individual. And that us does touch heavily on your own growth and development, right? If Des is critical to my development, then when I think about today, should I be at home, should I be in the office, I need to think about my access levels to Des. And if I start to think from those perspectives, then it becomes a much more broad-reaching conversation and a better level of consideration around outcomes. Is it going to be a successful outcome?
If I can just add, perhaps build on that, one thing around hybrid, and to link back to, I think, is what Antony said earlier on about DE&I, is I think hybrid working gives us a great opportunity to become more diverse as a sector. It's opening up, it's not narrowing down, it's actually opening up the opportunity for people wherever to work in a London market environment. If I think historically, there's the Lloyd's and London market have got quite a, it's changing, but historical reputation for not attracting people of different ethnic minorities. I think with hybrid working, and in terms of we don't care where they are, where they're based, they can still work in both the Lloyd's and London market environment and in the insurance sector, which hasn't got a great reputation, but it's improving. And so I see the hybrid model as an opportunity to change, as opposed to stay in the same kind of mix we have now. I think it opens loads of opportunities to have a diverse workforce, loads of opportunities to introduce people into the insurance sector, which possibly they wouldn't have considered before, because there's that shrug through to a main city or to London to do that kind of work. I think those times are drifting away now.
Yeah. And I guess linked to that, Des, is, as we look at a more flexible working style, it's all about choice and access to learning. So, for example, the LMA Academy, everything went virtual over the past couple of years. We've not automatically reverted back to everything being in the classroom. We've actually got, a hybrid approach insofar as some programs will be back in the classroom, some will continue to be virtual, and we're seeing equal demand for both for different reasons. There's a group of people who are desperate to get back into the office, to get into a classroom-based environment, but there's also an equal number of people who have really embraced virtual learning, like the short, pacey nature of a 90-minute session, perhaps the equivalent of a one-day learning over 2 weeks. So we're seeing demand for both of those, and I see that continuing without a shadow of a doubt. The other bit just to mention, Des, you talked about line managers there as well, and whilst we've been talking about upskilling and reskilling and what the future holds, let's not underestimate the power of a really good line manager in helping learners, once they've been on an event, take back that knowledge, turn that knowledge into a skill, into a capability, and create the right environment for them to succeed with that. Talk to them, listen to them. What support do you need? What are you going to try differently? How can I help you, embed some of that learning and apply it to your role on a day-to-day basis? Now we're back on a hybrid basis. That opportunity to engage on a one-on-one with a line manager is right up there. And, we should never underestimate the power of a line manager. And, we hear many times that people leave organizations because of a poor line manager. This is where managers can really step up, give something back to people, give something back to the market for sure.
Thanks, Andy. That's a really good point. So we've got 6 or 7 minutes left. So I think, first of all, let's try and address the first question that came through, which is around rewards. So I think I'll put this to you, Antony, given all the data you've got on this. But so a question from Ali was, would you agree there's a disparity between skill and salary expectations in the current market due to the war on talent, essentially? And she pointed to roles such as underwriting, but I think that can be answered more broadly.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, we're in a supply and demand challenge and a real squeeze around key roles, and that manifests itself in some uncomfortable ways from a reward outcomes perspective. One of the things we hear from our clients a lot at the moment is more and more kind of off-cycle requests and bid backs and all those kind of things, and that's something that, you know, unfortunately it is an unfortunate outcome of the situation we find ourselves in at the moment, but you know, has to be considered on a case-by-case basis. You know, we get the question, if I broaden out the rewards conversation a little bit, we get the question a lot about how do you pay for skills, how do you support pay through a reskilling type program, and again, that's another real challenge. I think that one of the things we probably need to do as organizations is become a little bit less individualistic about pay. So that's not about removing differentiation entirely, but we need to, one of the things we know as a fundamental around reward is that if pay is too volatile over time, it drives higher turnover. And you can draw the line where you put too volatile, but we need to bring more consistency in order to generate stability in the organization. And ultimately, that's what we're trying to do. So if people are being reskilled and moving through different phases, then you know, they need to feel comfortable and confident around the organization, and that it's going to support their financial needs through that transition as well. You know, we talk about resilience as a topic in the organization. That's about being able to cope with those changes. Agility is being able to make those changes at speed. But the third one we talk about is around belonging. And that belonging piece is ensuring people have the trust in the organization that they're willing to go in again and they're willing to go through that change. And rewards has got to be really right up there around the belonging piece when we think about people who are moving and transitioning from different roles. So I think that's one important point. The topic around that, which I think we probably need to address, and this touches on architecture and organizational structure. I mentioned the word earlier around transparency. We probably need to give a little bit more than we have historically, transparency around pay. And again, that is absolutely not about sharing individual salaries or anything like that, but do people have an understanding within this organization of what pay growth means, how it works, what they might be able to expect to some degree over time? And where on that spectrum any individual organization lands will be different, because it's a hugely emotive topic. That's not lost on me at all. But I would suggest that in insurance organizations and more broadly in financial services, we've probably been at the very untransparent end historically, and we could maybe share a little bit more to help people with an understanding of what it can mean for them. There's some of my thoughts, as I think it's always going to be very different for different firms, and they'll have their own histories to deal with.
Des, any thoughts on that as someone who'd have to bring that to fruition?
Well, I'm not going to disagree regarding expectation. I think there's for the first time the employee has got the proverbial power on their foot, and they're putting their foot to the floor to ensure that they are set for the future. I think in terms of the skills gaps, I think for us it's just making sure that when we take, you know, we still, again, I'll go back to recruit to our values. Those values are still then based, when you're looking for a role, that the individual can demonstrate the technical skills required, and if they can, you know, then you have to then pay the relative worth in the market as we are now. Now, I know there's lots of knock-on consequences of some of that, which Antony referred to, and I think we are seeing that in our recruitment currently, where, you know, there are, I think I was speaking to one of my colleagues in the US just a couple of days ago, and he was telling me that the people are leaving us now for 25,000 euros more for doing the same job. The company, they're essentially buying in, you know, and that's one of we've always had this challenge, you know, people buy in those skills and knowledge and don't develop them themselves. And in this particular market, that's what they're doing. You know, 25k's worth of euro makes that difference. So I think there are challenges, and I think it's just up to us to ensure that when they come through, we put the skills development in place to get them to where we need them to be, even if they don't come in as well as they are.
Brilliant, thanks, Des. And unfortunately, we're going to have to wrap up there. There was a question about PDPs, which I'll pose to the speakers offline and try and get an answer to the person who asked that question. But thank you all so much for doing that. That was a really insightful session, a great way to kick off the panels, I think. Lots more we can pick up in session 2, which is all around talent pipeline. So thanks again to everyone, and we will see you very shortly in the next live session.